That was the best introduction a person could ever have in absolutely the best venue for doing science outreach on this planet. Let's hear it for Science and Cocktails. Or as my partner Carolyn would have it, cocktails and science. So let's not forget that all of this is made possible by you buying more cocktails. So I am not going to be upset if you go back to the bar and get some more cocktails, because it's going to make my presentation seem a lot better. So I want to talk to you a little bit today about low pollution electric power. And I want to share 3 things tonight. First, why we need low pollution power at all. Second, I want to tell you a few of the really fun and important things that we've found in studying electric power. And I'm going to just take you through one of those things. And third, I want to tell you a little bit about markets for electric power, because that's how we get the companies the money that they need and the people the electricity they need, and tell you a little bit about where those markets stand when we will have lots of really low-cost power, and why we need to go change some of the things that we're doing right now. So first, why are we interested in variable power that goes up and down like the wind, or sometimes shuts off all night like solar power? Why are we interested in them at all? Well, it's not because we're running out of anything. We've got plenty of fossil fuels. Where would you like me to stand so we don't get the feedback? Is this good? Okay. We've got plenty of fossil fuels. The thing that we're running out of is the atmosphere in which to put their combustion products. That means when we burn them, we get things like soot and CO2. Let me make that more concrete. The Paris targets have us keep everything below 2 degrees centigrade, global warming. To do that, we have to put no more than 1,000 gigatons, 1,000 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But we know about 11,000 gigatons of fossil fuels, carbon, and that's just the stuff that we know about. We haven't looked for coal on this planet for 200 years. There's plenty more than that. We're not running out of fossil fuels. That's not why we do renewable resources. What we're running out is the atmosphere in which to put their junk. It is partially about carbon dioxide. And part of that is because we are using so much more electricity than we used to. When I was born back in the dark ages back here, carbon dioxide from power plants was only about 12% of all of the carbon dioxide that we emitted in the United States, where I have a lot of data. Now it's up to 40%. Well, that wouldn't have been so bad if we had been making the electric power grid a lot cleaner. And indeed, the grid is getting somewhat cleaner. We're about 1/3 cleaner as far as producing carbon dioxide than we were 70 years ago. But we need to do a lot better than that. In order to keep this planet below about 2 degrees C additional warming for our kids and grandkids, we need to get down here, around 400 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour produced. Now, the really stringent regulations that California passed in the US only get us down to 1,100 pounds. And the very best natural gas turbines that Siemens and General Electric have produced do about 700. So we've got a ways to go. Left to its own devices, the grid is getting less carbon per megawatt hour. But look at this graph. Same graph, except that instead of going to now, about 2020, it goes out to 2150. And the grid is getting cleaner, but left to its own devices, it's going to take another 100 years to get down to where we want to put electric power. And so that's one of the reasons why we're moving to sources like wind and solar. But the other is this. Carbon dioxide pollution is only part of the pollution story. What's killing people right now is stuff like this. I'm going to show you a time-lapse video of pollution in China about 18 months ago. And that pollution happened over about 20 minutes. I'm going to speed that up by a factor of 100 so you don't get bored. And this is what it looks like. This is from a fellow's hotel room as a wave of pollution, both power plant pollution and dust from the Gobi Desert, blew into Beijing over about 20 minutes. These small particles that get into your lungs and choke you and load up your heart so it eventually fails and cause other problems as odd as stomach cancer and breathing difficulties are only part of the problem. These particles are what are killing people right now. Particles that look just like this. Small things, 2.5 microns in diameter or smaller, get into your lungs. Well, one of the ways that scientists characterize how bad this is for you is we look at what are the odds that it's going to kill you. How much additional risk do you have from breathing particulate matter of a certain concentration? In this room, we'd measure the concentration in micrograms per cubic meter, right? And so we say, how many micrograms per cubic meter on the x-axis versus what are your odds of dying on the vertical axis? And those data look just like this. This is data published just last year. And here, your odds of dying are no worse at about 5 micrograms per cubic meter than they would be if you were in a completely unpolluted area, but it rises fast. And by the time you're out here to 16 micrograms per cubic meter, you have a 10% additional risk of dying due to these small particulate matter pollution. Well, in the United States, our standard is 35. That's way out here. Imagine where this graph is. In the EU, the annual standard is about 25 micrograms per cubic meter. But in 1 hour, the EU allows up to 350. So it's that kind of stuff that we really worry about. That's what's just the clear and present danger. And so let me make this a little more concrete. This is a picture taken from satellite of one of the components that makes up this kind of small particulate matter, sulfur dioxide. That's burnt sulfur, for those of us who aren't chemists. And so this is a satellite image just 3 weeks ago when I was putting together this talk. So here's Europe. Scandinavia hasn't much pollution, neither does Denmark. But down here in Central Europe, you can see the individual power plants by dark dots. Those are up around 150. Remember, the safe level is 5. 5's down around here, you know, what you see in North Africa, or in this case in Spain and southern France. But much of Europe and a bunch of Russia is polluted by SO2 from power plants. Well, look at China. That stands out, eastern China, because, of course, they've fueled a lot of their great leap forward by burning coal. India, too. Here's Mumbai, Chennai, and some of the plants in the big coal region of India. The United States, on this day, had a big high-pressure area sitting off the coast that was driving pollution from the power plants in southeast United States and along the Ohio Valley and near us in Pennsylvania, right up into the Northeast to dangerous levels. That's the clear and present danger that we need to fix right now. Because in the United States alone, we're killing something like 10,000 people a year from this kind of pollution just from power plants. Air, water, and soil pollution around the world kill altogether about 9 million people every year. And I'm going to show you a graphic from Carnegie Mellon's CREATE lab that makes that, well, graphical. So here is a graphic that shows the deaths in each country every year from air pollution. And the United States would have been 15 years ago a lot bigger. We know how to clean this up. We're just not doing it as well as we should. To put that in context, if you turn on the news, you hear a lot about violent deaths. these little circles are the violent deaths in each country compared to the pollution deaths, which we don't see on the evening news because they kill people one by one, not violently in 14 people getting massacred in a school, which makes the news. But nevertheless, it kills a lot more people. One of the ways to mitigate that is switching fuels from dirty coal to fairly clean-burning natural gas. By doing that, you reduce the emissions of that particular particulate, sulfur dioxide, by 90%, and another constituent that makes small particles, nitrous oxides, by more than half. And that reduces the health costs of pollution in the US up to $50 billion a year. This is a graphic that we made for a paper that appeared a couple of years ago that shows in the dark bars here the cost of pollution in each of the regions of the United States from power plants fueled by coal. If we switched to power plants fueled by natural gas, boy, there'd still be some human health costs, but it sure is a lot less. And aggregated together, that's as much as $50 billion a year less. So that's one strategy. But of course, we can do even more by switching to wind, solar power, intermittent, variable sources, but they don't pollute. And of course, Europe has provided the first big incentives for doing that. And again, my friend, Professor Elin Orbosch at Carnegie Mellon University CREATE Lab has done that, kind of a graphic. And I want to show you how many people here are from Denmark originally, lived there. Great. You led the way. And what I'm going to show you here is a graphic that shows a map of Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and each little dot that appears is going to be a new wind farm, or wind park, as we call them in Europe. This graphic runs from 1984 to 2015, when we had the last data. And you'll see the dots first appear in Denmark, and then appear in Germany, and then go throughout Europe. So I want to share with you how much Denmark led the way. And here's Denmark up here, and you can see all the wind parks appearing, gradually moving south. Italy, Portugal, Spain, and finally England over here. You want to see that again? Yeah, okay, there we go. So Denmark absolutely led the way, quite literally in wind. Now, let me show you by country how wind has gone from 2000 to 2015. And you can see at the end, even China has dramatically increased the amount of wind power that they have in China. Here's Denmark right there, Germany, France, Portugal. And again, China coming on here in the end. So what's the mix that we have for fuel at the moment? In the EU, 30% of electricity is generated by renewables, but there's 56%, which is low pollution power. And the difference, of course, is this slice here, nuclear. In the US, it's a similar situation, although we have more produced by coal and gas. But 17% of US electricity is now produced by renewables, and 38% by low pollution power. I'm going to show you a time history of how the US has fared. When I was born, we had about a third of our power supplied by renewables. That was hydroelectric power. A little bit of biomass, but mostly hydroelectric power. And that got diluted and diluted and diluted as demand grew and the hydro resources had been fully tapped out. And then recently, the renewables started growing again because of the introduction of wind, a little bit of solar in the US, but it's mostly wind. But the low pollution power started to increase back in the 1970s with the introduction of nuclear power. And as I said, we're about 38% in the US. The difficulty is going to come if those nuclear power plants shut down because of age or other reasons. How are we going to replace that very big chunk? Here, we have increased the amount of wind and solar power from about here to here, But that's a big gap to fill. And it is that clear and present danger of particulate matter getting into your lungs and strangling you that I'm worried about, as well as the longer-term issues of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases pollution. And we have increased the amount of wind power in the U.S. recently. This is all of the renewables. This is hydroelectric power going up and down. What are these dips? Droughts, exactly, droughts. We get about one big and one small drought every decade in the U.S. It's similar in Western Europe. And so it's up and down. It's variable on the time scale of a year or a decade. But we have increased greatly the amount of wind power in the United States. How is wind doing? Well, the windiest area in the U.S. is the central part of the United States, from Texas all the way up to North Dakota. And there's one power pool that's headed by a friend of mine, Nick Brown, and he's given me a couple of slides that I wanted to share with you. Here's the windy area in purple, and this is where the Southwest Power Pool is. Southwest Power Pool has a bunch of wind farms, almost 200 wind farms, 9,000 individual turbines. Their maximum penetration was almost 60% wind power just about 2 months ago, and their peak was almost 16 gigawatts. Well, Denmark's got some pretty good peaks, and Denmark generated 140% of its power back in February of 2017 by wind. So let's compare Denmark to the U.S. state of Kansas. The wind penetration, say again? Say what?
Go Denmark wind.
Go Denmark wind, yeah. Denmark wind was 116%, but Kansas isn't far behind. And in terms of generation, in terms of the wind generation, the United States has some areas that are just as windy as Denmark is. And how do we cope with that? Well, as the wind goes up and down, wind's in green here, right? Wind is green. So as the wind goes down, what we do is we ramp up natural gas plants and even coal plants and counter the wind going down. And the details of how we do that are what a lot of groups around the world, led by DTU here in Denmark, have been doing over the years. Yes, let's hear it for DTU. Yeah, all right. So as the wind drops, we ramp up other plants to take the load. Well, so that's the first thing I wanted to talk to you about tonight, to share with you. The second thing is some fun stuff. There's a lot of fun that you can have with wind and solar power science. Oh, how'd this get in here? Yeah, that's some fun too. Did I mention go buy some cocktails? Okay. So wind and solar power's output varies. This is all of the wind plants in the U.S. state of Texas, about 4 times the amount of wind that there is in Denmark. And this is 2 years' worth of data taken every hour, and it's up and down and up and down, and that's why you have to fill it in. Well, we can learn lots of things by examining how this stuff exactly goes up and down. So there is music in the wind, and just as the disembodied voice of the introducer looked at the trace of his voice going up and down, I want you to listen to the music in the wind here. This is 2 years' worth of wind data sped up to about 12 seconds. This is what it sounds like. So you hear all of those low notes. Now, that's not what we call white noise. It's not the kind of stuff that you use to put yourself asleep at night. White noise sounds like this. There's a lot more high frequency in this. The volume of the high notes, the treble notes, is much higher than it is for the actual wind. That has enormous consequences. Wind's variability is not white noise. It means that the up and down, the fluctuations, the volume at high frequencies is much less, hundreds of times less than it is at low frequencies. You heard that for yourself. If wind's variability had been white noise, we could never have afforded to integrate wind power into the electrical power grid, because we would have needed a tremendous amount of really fast-moving things, batteries, antimatter power, stuff that hasn't been invented yet, to take care of the fluctuations in the wind. The fact that the fluctuations are 100 times larger at low frequencies, which you could hear by your ear, means that we can afford to integrate wind power. So let me show you what the character of that fluctuation is. Everybody has an equalizer on their eye thingy of one sort. There's the high notes and the low notes. So I'm going to show you what you just heard. This is a graph of the volume of the low notes and the high notes for a wind farm, a wind park, as you call them here in Europe. And it's hundreds of times noisier at low frequencies, that low rumble that you heard, than it is at high frequencies, right? We can learn lots of fun things from this and some important things. Let me just share with you one of the fun things that we can learn that's also very important. One of the really interesting questions operationally about wind is, if I add together a lot of wind parks, if each one of you in this room had a wind park and you were spread out across Europe, and we added the output of your wind turbines together, would it smooth right out or not? That geographic smoothing, as specialists call it, can be examined by listening to the low and the high notes. Remember, this is what wind looks like. This is one wind park. Suppose I add 4 of them together. Look what happens. The high frequencies are reduced. They get smoothed out. The really high notes get smoothed out. Here's 20 of them added together, more smoothing of the high notes. But the low notes, where most of the volume is, most of the noise is at the low notes, they don't get smoothed at all, hardly at all. And that turns out to be good news, because these can get smoothed out by really slow ramping plants, hydroelectric, gas, coal if you like. And the high ones can get smoothed by adding a bunch of wind parks together geographically. So when we talk about smoothing, one of the things is that the time scale really matters. 12 hours, 24 hours has much less smoothing than out here at 1 hour. And so I'll show you that in the next slide. And I'm also going to talk about the second thing that we find with smoothing. So here is what happens when I add up to all 20 of those wind parks in Texas together. I first have no smoothing with one wind plant, and then at 1 hour, I get out about 95% of all of the fluctuations. But at 12 hours, I only get out half. So that's the first point. The second point is that after I get done adding a half a dozen wind plants, 5 or 6 wind plants together, I don't get any more smoothing. And that's great, because it means I don't need to spend a tremendous amount of money on transmission lines tying every wind park on the continent together. Now, I might need to do it for other reasons, like moving North Dakota wind to Chicago. But I don't need to do that to smooth out the fluctuations. Okay. So what's it look like for solar? This is when we took these data, one of the largest solar plants in the United States. And so the sun comes up, it gets to be noon, the sun goes back down. That's what it looks like. Well, the very next day, it looks like this, right? What causes that? Yeah, you'll notice that their publicity photo has clouds in it, right? Okay, so sure, that's clouds. And this is what it looks like on another day, and a higher resolution data on another day. And these clouds come across, and they just cancel out all of the sun going to the solar plant. So we examined 50 large solar plants in the Indian state of Gujarat in western India. It's a desert, nice place to put solar plants. And we found the same kind of graphs, but what we found is that there's much less smoothing for solar plants than there is for wind plants. Here is wind, and remember we got about 95% of the smoothing at 1 hour out, connecting 20 sites together. Connecting 20 solar sites together, you only get less than half. Same thing at 6 hours. So there's much less smoothing geographically when you connect photovoltaic plants together than when you connect wind plants. So that'll be interesting as solar comes up. It's 3.7% of all production in the EU. It's about 1.8% in the US at the moment, but it's coming up in both places. So that means that we need other ways of smoothing the ups and downs of wind and solar power, right? Hydroelectric dams, gas plants, biomass plants, coal plants, batteries and other storage, and smart appliances can do it at the other end. Well, how do we get those smart appliances or those batteries paid? We have markets for electric power. And so now I want to, in the last portion of the sharing with you tonight, talk about markets. So this is the price of electric power over 36 hours right near where I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's up and down. Markets do that. So markets for electric power exist not all over the world. They started in South America and then spread to Europe and to North America, Singapore, an outpost here, Australia, and so forth. But it's not all over the world. There are a significant number of places. So what do we mean by a market? A market's a place where buyers and sellers can haggle over the price of, say, tomatoes or peppers here. When I'm buying, the lower the price, the more tomatoes I'm going to buy, right? And so I can graph that by saying the price is high, I'm not going to buy very many tomatoes. If the price is low, I'm going to buy a lot of tomatoes. On the other hand, if I'm selling the tomatoes, the higher the price, the more I'm willing to sell, right? The graph looks like this for the seller. So in a competitive market, if I've got a lot of farmers selling in that market there, if one seller charges much more than their cost of producing those tomatoes, the buyer's going to go to another market. So everyone sells their tomatoes for not much more than it costs to produce. That's why we like markets. In most electricity markets, some generators, like oil plants, cost much more to run than other generators, like a wind plant. But every generator in an electric power market gets the same price. The same price is the price that the very last generator that's needed to meet demand in that hour charges. That would be a competitive price if all of us are making electric power. So why is that? That's because if I'm a wind park and it doesn't cost me much to generate power, and let's say you own a coal plant that is the last one that's needed to meet demand for everybody else to make the dry ice that goes into the black hole cocktails here, right? If you bid in 5 cents a kilowatt hour and I bid in 1 cent, the next day I'm going to get fired because my boss says I should have known what she was going to charge for her power, and the next day my replacement's going to come in and bid 5 cents. So that's why in a competitive electricity market, everybody gets the same price. Okay. So let me show you a real electricity market. This is Texas, and this is the quantity in gigawatts. This is the price in cents per kilowatt hour. It could be euro cents. It's about the same. Here are wind plants whose cost is zero, and gas plants and coal plants and some really bad, expensive oil plants and bad gas plants up here. Now let's suppose that demand curve looks like this. And so in this hour, we need 80 gigawatts of power for everybody's air conditioner and dry ice machines too. Then the price is here, and the generators all get paid the same. And so this rectangle represents the amount of money that gets transferred to the generators. The total paid to the generators in that hour is the area of that box. That's about $1.5 million. That's higher than the fuel cost for the wind folks down here, higher than the fuel cost for the gas and the coal plants. So everybody can pay their mortgage. They can pay all their fixed costs and their maintenance. That's good. Now, let me take you back to this curve. This is the wind at the moment. Let me double the amount of wind. Look what happens. Here's the wind now. Here's the other stuff. Here's the demand. And now I double the amount of wind, and that moves the rest of the plants off to the right. I don't need many of those if I have that same 80 gigawatts of demand. So the area looks like this. I can quadruple the amount of wind, and the area would look like this. What that means is that running for 1 hour, the amount of money paid to the generators goes from 1.5 million down to half of that. That's great for consumers, right? Let's hear it for consumers. Hey. At least until the generators go out of business. And the reason they go out of business is they can't recover the cost of building the wind park or the batteries or the natural gas plants that they need because the prices dropped way too low. And the markets that we have now rely on this kind of mechanism to compensate all of the generators. So what we have in this power market right next to my university is the prices go up and down. But look at this. The prices sometimes go below zero. That means that the wind plants, and in this case, nuclear power plants that can't go offline, can't stop producing power when the wind is blowing hard, have generated more power than the consumers need. It might be 3 in the morning and nobody's running their dry ice machines. So they have to actually pay the grid to put that power onto the grid. So that's a real challenge. Right now in the US, low natural gas prices set the market clearing price for most of the time. That means oil and coal and nuclear plants are going out of business. They can't recover their cost of building the plant. That situation has become more common as a lot of zero fuel cost generators like wind, solar power, they come onto the market. Denmark last year I had any data, was 40% wind and solar. Germany in 2017 was 26% wind and solar. The US is still only 8% wind and solar. But that means that in the EU, we're getting pretty close to the tipping point of where these generators are going to have serious problems recovering their costs. The plants needed to smooth out the wind and the solar power, like hydroelectric and natural gas and batteries, won't be paid enough to stay in business, and that's really challenging for reliability. Above maybe 1/3, and we're close to that, wind or solar power, we're going to need entirely different markets for these quantities. And that's going to be just wonderful for people like you who are young enough to make a new electric power system, a completely new grid. Not only is it going to be clean enough so that all those small particulates don't choke you, not only is it going to be clean enough that it doesn't put CO2 into the atmosphere, but it's also going to have tremendous fun capabilities like those music of the wind graphs that I showed you. And you are going to have the opportunity to make markets into something that work for the people who are making the power, but also for those of us who are making dry ice and consuming it. So I know that all of my students here and my co-faculty members are having tremendous fun with this. And I hope that you will join us in remaking the electric power grid so that it becomes a fun place for all of us. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.